Hello and welcome to the third video about what we've been doing in humanities this quarter so far. And we're going to turn our attention to the process of the American colonies gaining independence from Great Britain by the 4th of July 1776. So, in 1620, the Mayflower landed on Plymouth Rock with pilgrims from Great Britain. And basically these pilgrims had moved over and travelled across to these new lands in the search and the hope for a new life and a fresh start. Who wouldn't want that? And eventually over time, from one colony, Great Britain expands her reach to 13 colonies on the east coast of America. And basically, if you're trying to analyse the relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies and the development of that, then you need to just look at any relationship between a mother and her child. Because pretty much that's what you have. Because at the start of the visit by the people to the American colonies, then they would really need Britain. And they would need the money and the wealth and the support and trade to help it to, survive and to be able to adapt. And then gradually, as the colonies expanded and they got more experience there, then they kind of didn't need Great Britain so much anymore. And it's kind of the same as when we get older, where, at the very beginning, our mum does everything for us, and as we get older, we believe that we don't need mum anymore because we're older and we have our own independence, we have our own identity, we have our own beliefs, and we should be able to be a little bit freer. So, basically, there were four key factors which contributed to the American independence in 1776. And the major factor was that the American colonies were being taxed by King George III, but in return for that money going to Great Britain, the colonies got nothing. They didn't get a say in Parliament, and that is what is called taxation without representation, so that their pounds would go over to Great Britain and they wouldn't have a say in where it was spent or how it was spent. They didn't get the same equal rights that those in Britain got. Now, because those in America are or were British subjects, then surely they should get the same rights as those in Britain. So they argued that this was going against the Magna Carta. So what you have is the beginning, and you can see an element of liberalism creeping into the American colonies. Then, in order to ensure that the money was obtained, King George III thought, well, the best thing is we'll send the army in. And there was the incident called the Boston Massacre, where the British soldiers fired on the people of Boston and killed some people. This obviously enraged the people of Boston, so to get their own back, they instigated the third major factor of American independence, and that was the Boston Tea Party. Now, tea, as you will have seen from the video, and as you will probably see from countless Mr. Bean movies, etc., that Brits love their tea. And therefore, in those days, it was big trade for Britain. And so all of the tea was in the Boston port, and the colonies decided to invade the port and to throw all of the tea into the sea, causing hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of damage to Great Britain financially, but also politically, because this would have been one of the few times that they had been challenged. And then, after the Boston Tea Party, in order to recover the loss and to re-establish their power and their dominance, the British enacted what is called the Coercive Acts of 1774. The Coercive Acts of 1774 were called the Intolerable Acts by those in America. And therefore it's basically saying that these acts that Britain is putting on us, we cannot live by. It's insufferable, we cannot abide to do that. and there were 5 key acts. The first one was the Boston Port Act. Now, the Boston Port Act prevented ships leaving or entering the harbour of Boston, which impacted the trade and the economy of Boston. The second one was the Massachusetts Government Act, which prevented the Massachusetts state from having its own form of government or rule, because it's got to be ruled by King George III. The third intolerable act is the administration of justice. And what this said that was that if a British soldier committed a crime in any of the colonies, that the trial would have to be heard in Great Britain, which means that the victim would have to travel all the way from the colonies back to Great Britain to hear the trial. And once the soldier then left to return to Great Britain, then there's very little chance of justice. The fourth intolerable act was called the Quartering Act. And basically that was that if there was no available space for the British soldiers to stay, then the civilians, the normal people, the civilians would have had to put the British soldiers up in their own homes at their own expense. And then there was the Quebec Act. Quebec is in Canada and it borders America. And therefore what the British did was to expand the territory of Quebec, so therefore reducing the territory of America, but also increasing the availability of the British military to be closer to the colonies should they be required. So those are the 4 factors that that put America on the path for independence: the tax without representation, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the Intolerable Acts. And one of the reasons that the British were levying taxes on the American colonies was because they'd lost a lot of money in the 7 Years' War with France, and therefore they needed to balance the budget. Therefore, they had to tax those in their colonies, i.e. the Americans. Now, not only did the Americans succeed in overthrowing Great Britain, they also were able to overthrow a belief system. They were able to overthrow what we would call an absolutist king that did not give, any rights or freedoms to the colonies in America. And what they replaced it was with a sense of nationalism, and one would argue possibly a sense of liberalism, in that everybody had equal rights, everybody would be able to vote. They created the mechanisms of state, so you had the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And this was again influenced from the French Enlightenment thinkers. So what we're beginning to see is that the strands are connecting throughout history. And what we're seeing is that the beliefs from the Enlightenment period have transferred across place, space, and time to the American colonies. And that has impacted their political thought, that has impacted their national identity, and it has helped create the country of America that we kind of see today. The groundwork was put in by the 13 colonies when they were part of the British Empire at that point in time. Okay, so that is pretty much our video on the American independence, but there's a few things that you must take away from this, okay? The first is that there are 4 key factors to the American road to independence. There were 5 intolerable acts. These intolerable acts were basically unacceptable to the American colonies, the people living in the American colonies at that time. The third most important thing that you really need to take away from here is that the identity of America that we see today is as a result of what happened way back when in the 1700s, because you have one political ideology of, say, absolutism, okay, and a monarchical rule by a king being replaced by a democratic, more liberal-minded government and procedure. So it's not just the removal of a king, It is the removal of a belief. It is the removal of an ideology. And that's what you also really need to remember when you're considering the identity of America. For America to be independent, they had to be different, and therefore they took the opposite to the rule that they had previously under the British. That's all. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.